Welcome back, everyone. Today we delve into a tale centered around the man known as Saitama. This is a non-canon hypothetical scenario, exploring the paradox of absolute power within the grim darkness of the far future. Imagine a hero who fights for a hobby suddenly cast into a galaxy where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods. What occurs when a being of pure, indifferent strength meets a reality fueled by suffering? Deep within the industrial heart of a Forge world, a secret is about to be unearthed, a silence that could either save the Imperium or shatter it forever. The story begins now. The sky above the Forge world of Orestes did not scream, it bled. High above the towering spires of the manufactorums, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of industrial incense. For millennia, this world had served the machine god, its crust carved into a labyrinth of gears, cooling vents, and sacred data shrines. But tonight, the rhythmic thrum of the great engines was drowned out by a sound that defied logic. It was a low, vibrational hum that rattled the bones of the millions of tech thralls working in the depths. The great rift that jagged wound across the galaxy pulsed with a sickly violet light. But here near the experimental Pylon site, the colors were draining away into a monochromatic gray. At the center of the hexagrammatic ward chamber, Magos Kepra 9 stood like a skeletal sentinel. Her body more cold steel and fiber optics than flesh hissed as hydraulic fluids circulated through her remaining biological components. She was surrounded by a choir of 300 servitors, their lobotomized brains hardwired into the G-mirror, the Pylon Mirror. It was a device of forbidden provenance, a jagged monolith of black stone, inscribed with glowing emerald runes, that hummed with a frequency that made the very air feel heavy and stagnant. Keeper 9's optical sensors flickered with binary code as she monitored the energy output. They were attempting to do the impossible, to create a zone of absolute silence within the warp, a vacuum where the demons of the Imperium could not breathe. Initiate the final sequence, Keeper 9 commanded, her voice a grating synthesis of vox, grills, and static. The machine god demands the void. Let the cacophony of the heretic be silenced by the purity of the null. As she spoke, the Pylon Mirror began to rotate its surface, absorbing the light from the flickering torches. Suddenly the warp did not roar in retaliation. Instead, it went silent. It was a terrifying, unnatural pressure, an atmospheric drop that made the vox casters of the Skitarii guards outside burst into static. The psychic screaming that usually haunted the peripheral vision of every living soul on Orestes simply vanished. In its place was a void so profound it felt as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for a heart that had stopped beating. The data streams feeding into Kepra 9's cortex suddenly turned to zeros. It wasn't that the sensors had failed, it was as if there was nothing left to measure. The parameters are null, she whispered, a rare tremor of uncertainty in her mechanical tone. It is not that the entity does not exist, it is that it has swallowed the data whole. Before she could recalibrate, the ceiling of reality did not just crack, it shattered. A hole, jagged and blindingly white, tore open directly above the Pylon Mirror. There was no explosion, no thunderous boom, only a soft pop like a bubble bursting in the dark. From that white void, a shape began to descend. It was not a winged demon of Khorne, nor a multifaceted horror of Tzeentch. It was a man. He fell with a peculiar lack of grace, his limbs flailing slightly in the low gravity of the chamber. He wore a suit of bright mustard yellow fabric that looked absurdly out of place against the grim Gothic architecture of the forge. A white cape frayed at the edges and caked in the dust of 1,000 mundane battles trailed behind him like a funeral shroud for common sense. As he plummeted toward the polished obsidian floor, there was no aura of divinity, No psychic pressure, only the sound of wind rushing past a bald head that caught the dim light of the dying forge fires. The impact should have leveled the cathedral. Instead, the man landed on his feet with a dull thud that sent a small cloud of gray soot into the air. He stood there for a moment, hunched over, patting his pockets, with a look of mild annoyance. Magos Kepra 9 stared her multi-lensed eyes, zooming in on the intruder. She looked for a soul, for a warp signature, for a spark of the divine or the diabolical. She found nothing. To her sensors, the man standing in the center of the most sacred and dangerous experiment in the sector was a hole in the universe, a walking, breathing vacuum. The man looked up, blinking at the towering Magos and the rows of chanting half-metal slaves. He reached up to scratch the back of his head, his face a mask of utter boredom. Is this the grocery store?" he asked, his voice, flat and unimpressive, echoing through the chamber that had, only moments ago, been the threshold of a cosmic cataclysm. "I think I took a wrong turn at the supermarket, and man, it's really dusty in here." He looked at the Pylon Mirror, then at the terrified tech priests, and sighed. The silence he brought with him wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of fate. The strings of destiny, so carefully woven by the dark gods, seemed to fray and snap in his very presence. High above the hive city of Orestes continued to groan under its own weight, oblivious to the fact that a null entity had just crashed into their reality. In the shadows of the spires, the Inquisition's sensors began to scream. A red alert was spreading through the Vox channels of the Ordo Hereticus. A black hole of the soul had arrived. Saitama stood amidst the ruins of a failed ritual, a hero of a world long gone, staring into the face of a nightmare galaxy and wondering if he'd ever make it back in time for the Saturday sale. The air in the Underhive did not just exist, it oppressed. It was a thick, stagnant soup of recycled oxygen, heavy with the stench of promethium fumes, ancient rot, and the metallic tang of dried blood. Saitama wandered through a forest of rusted pipes and dripping conduits, his red boots splashing through puddles of bioluminescent sludge that glowed with a sickly radioactive green. He looked up, but there was no sky, only the jagged iron ribcage of a city built upon the corpses of its own history. Layer upon layer of metal and misery stretched upward for miles, a vertical tomb where the sun was a forgotten myth and the only light came from the flickering sparks of dying machinery. He adjusted his cape, which was already beginning to collect a fine layer of industrial soot. To any inhabitant of this hellish labyrinth, the sight of a man in bright yellow spandex would have been a sign of madness or a hallucination born of starvation. But Saitama simply looked bored. He stepped over a skeletal remain, whether it was human or something else he couldn't tell, and sighed. The silence of the warp breach had followed him down here, a bubble of normalcy that seemed to push back against the suffocating weight of the hive. A sudden high-pitched scream tore through the low hum of the ventilators. In a nearby alleyway, a group of sludge rats, dregs of the hive, who had replaced their humanity with jagged scraps of metal, and a hunger for violence had cornered a small, shivering figure. The child was barely recognizable through the grime, clutching a rusted canister of water as if it were a holy relic. The gang leader, a brute with a hydraulic claw, where his left arm should have been, stepped forward, his eyes glowing with a frenzied, chem-induced light. Hand it over, rattling, the brute growled the gears in his arm, grinding with a sound like teeth on bone. "Or I'll use your ribs to patch the boiler." Saitama appeared at the mouth of the alley. He didn't run. He simply walked, his footsteps silent on the iron floor. The gangers didn't even notice him until he was standing a few feet away. The leader turned, his cybernetic eye whirring as it tried to identify the intruder. "What's this?" A clown lost his way from the spire. The brute mocked, raising his massive claw. The other gangers laughed, a harsh, rattling sound that was more cough than mirth. They saw a bald man with a vacant expression. They did not see the end of their world. From the shadows of a rusted catwalk above Sergeant Rook of the Orestes, PDF watched through his magnoculars. He had been tracking the gang for hours, waiting for an opening, but now his breath caught in his throat. He saw the stranger in yellow move. It wasn't a blur. It was as if the man simply ceased to be in one spot and appeared in another. There was no flash of light, no crackle of psychic energy, no smell of brimstone that accompanied the arrival of a warp-spawned horror. There was only a soft thud. The gang leader's hydraulic claw, a machine capable of crushing a reinforced door, shattered into 1,000 jagged splinters. Saitama had not punched him. He had merely flicked the metal with a gloved finger. The shockwave of the impact didn't just break the weapon, it sent the brute flying backward through a thick, corrugated steel wall, as if he had been hit by a runaway freight train. The wall buckled and tore, and the leader disappeared into the darkness of a deep ventilation shaft, without even a scream. The remaining gangers froze, their weapons trembling in hands that had known only cruelty, now suddenly gripped by a primal, soul-deep terror. Saitama looked at the child, then at the frozen gangers. "Hey," he said, his voice flat and remarkably ordinary in the face of the carnage he had just wrought. "You guys shouldn't bully kids. It's not cool." One of the gangers, driven by a cocktail of panic and combat drugs, leveled a rusted autogun and emptied the clip. The heavy slugs hammered into Saitama's chest, sparks flying as they crumpled against his suit and fell to the floor like harmless pebbles. He didn't even flinch. He walked forward, took the gun from the man's shaking hands, and tied the barrel into a neat, metallic knot. "And another thing," Saitama added, looking around at the desolate, crumbling ruins. "Does anyone know where the nearest supermarket is? I'm looking for the weekend sale, but I think I'm pretty far off the map." The gangers turned and bolted, disappearing into the shadows of the pipes, leaving their weapons and their pride behind. The child stared up at the bald man, eyes wide with a mixture of awe and confusion. In a world where every power came at a price of blood or soul, this man was a phantom. He was a miracle that made no sense. Up on the catwalk, Sergeant Rook lowered his magnoculars, his hands shaking. He had seen the Emperor's Chosen, the Space Marines, fight with the fury of demigods. He had seen the terrifying elegance of the Eldar and the brute strength of the Orcs. But this was different. This man had no aura, no light of the warp, no smell of the divine. He was a vacuum. He was a hole in the very fabric of the Imperial Creed. Rook adjusted his Vox speed, his voice cracking as he transmitted to his superiors. "Sector 4G. We have an anomaly. An unidentified null entity is active in the Underhive, requesting immediate instructions." Miles above, in the cold, sanctified halls of the spire, a red rune began to pulse on a holographic map. It caught the eye of an acolyte serving the Inquisition. The sensor readings were impossible, a localized zone of infinite physical density with zero psychic resonance. It was as if a piece of the universe had simply stopped obeying the laws of the warp. The report was instantly escalated to the highest levels of the Ordo Hereticus. A soul black hole had been detected, and the machinery of the Inquisition began to turn with a cold, murderous intent. "Excuse me, old man," Saitama called out, looking up at the catwalk where Rook was hiding. "I can hear you talking to yourself. Is there a grocery store around here that's still open after whatever disaster just happened? I'm really hoping they still have the discount on the premium beef." Rook didn't answer. He couldn't. He was staring down at a being that had just rewritten the rules of survival in the Hive with a single flick of a finger. The grim darkness of the 41st millennium had just encountered something it wasn't prepared for a hero who didn't care about the stakes. The refugee station was a hollowed-out cathedral of industry, a place where the desperate clung to the hope of a miracle, while the gears of the hive ground on. Thousands of citizens, their faces etched with the grime of a dozen shifts, huddled together in the flickering light of tallow candles and dying glow globes. Sergeant Rook walked with a stiff, mechanical gait, his hand hovering near his bolt pistol. Behind him followed the man in yellow. Saitama looked around with the mild curiosity of a tourist who had found himself in a particularly dull museum. He didn't seem to notice the way the crowds parted for him, nor the way the air seemed to chill in his wake. To the refugees, he was a ghost. To the soldiers, he was a threat that their training hadn't prepared them to face. The entrance to the inner sanctum was guarded by a squad of stormtroopers, their carapace armor gleaming like beetle shells under the harsh floodlights. As Rook approached, the guards snapped their lasguns into firing positions, the red dots of their searchlights dancing across Saitama's chest and face. "Stand down," Rook shouted, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He's a survivor from the lower levels, an anomaly." Saitama merely yawned, the sound echoing strangely in the vaulted chamber. "Are we almost there?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "I'm starting to think I missed the early bird special." The heavy iron doors groaned open, revealing a chamber filled with the rhythmic clicking of cogitators and the low Gregorian chant of a data stack. At the center of the room stood a figure that radiated a cold, absolute power. Inquisitor Lyra Voss of the Ordo Hereticus was a woman forged from iron and scripture. Her black power armor was etched with silver prayers, and a massive cloak of crimson velvet flowed behind her like a river of blood. As she turned, the very air seemed to thicken with the weight of her presence. Her eyes, one biological and sharp the other, a glowing sapphire cybernetic lens, locked onto Saitama. She did not speak at first. She simply observed. The silence that followed her was different from the silence Saitama carried. Hers was a silence of suppression of a predator watching its prey. "Sergeant," she finally said, her voice a low, melodic blade. "Explain why you have brought this jester into a sanctified command post during a high-level warp incursion." Rook swallowed hard, his throat dry. "My lady," he destroyed a heavy-duty hydraulic claw with a touch. "The scanners, they didn't know what to make of him." Lyra's cybernetic eye whirred, zooming in on the plain, unremarkable face of the man before her. "Step forward," Citizen Lyra commanded. Saitama complied, his boots clacking casually on the sacred floor tiles. He stood before the Inquisitor nearly a head shorter than her armored frame, and looked her in the eye without a hint of the fear that usually paralyzed those in her presence. "Nice outfit," Saitama remarked, pointing at her ornate shoulder pads. "Is it heavy?" "Looks like it would be a pain to wash." A collective gasp went up from the acolytes and servo skulls hovering in the background. To speak to an Inquisitor with such flippancy was a death sentence in any other context. Lyra's expression didn't change, but a vein throbbed at her temple. She gestured to a Magos biologist standing near a massive brass-encased gene scanner. "Scan him. I want a full biological profile, a psyker-level assessment, and a soul echo resonance. Now!" The Magos moved forward, his mechanical dendrites twitching as they adjusted the lenses of the machine. A halo of green light descended over Saitama, bathing him in a grid of emerald lasers. The humming of the machine grew louder, rising in pitch until it became a piercing shriek that made the soldiers wince. Suddenly, the cogitators began to smoke. The data screens flickered with impossible strings of gibberish, and the brass casing of the scanner started to glow a dull, angry red. The Magos scrambled back his hands, waving frantically. It's "It's not working, the logic engines are seizing," he cried out. "The parameters are exceeding every known limit. It's like trying to measure the volume of the sun with a thimble." With a final violent crack, the main terminal exploded in a shower of sparks and molten glass. The chanting of the data stack died, instantly replaced by a terrifying, hollow quiet. Saitama stood in the center of the wreckage, unfazed. "Did I break something?" he asked, looking down at the burnt remains of the scanner. "I didn't even touch it." Lyra Voss stepped closer, her hand resting on the hilt of her power sword. She looked at the readouts that had survived jagged lines that went off the charts before the crash. Her cybernetic eye flickered as it processed the fragments of data. "He has no soul," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the short-circuited wires. "Or his soul is heavier than this entire planet. There is no middle ground." The room was plunged into a tense, suffocating standoff. The soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons, their knuckles white. They were trained to fight demons, heretics, and Xenos, things that had a place in their theology. But Saitama was a void. He was a variable that didn't fit into any equation of the imperial truth. According to the rigid protocols of the Ordo Hereticus, anything that could not be classified was a threat. Anything that existed outside the Emperor's light was a shadow that needed to be purged. Lyra's hand tightened around her weapon. The sapphire light of her eye glowed with an intense, murderous brilliance. "The result is null," she declared, her voice cold as the void between stars. "By the authority of the Holy Inquisition, you are declared a class extreme anomaly. You will submit to containment or you will be erased." She drew her power sword, the blade igniting with a hum of blue energy that cut through the dim light of the chamber. Saitama looked at the glowing blade, then back at her, and sighed. "Man," he muttered, "everyone here is so cranky. I just want to know if there's a sale." The sword leveled at his throat, but the man didn't move. The interrogation chamber was a tomb of cold iron buried beneath miles of industrial strata and psychic dampening fields. It was designed to break the will of the most hardened heretics, a place where the air tasted of stale incense and the copper tang of old fear. Inquisitor Lyra Voss sat across from Saitama, her face illuminated by a single harsh, vertical lumen beam that made her shadows look like jagged knives. Behind her, two interrogator acolytes stood like statues, their silver masks reflecting the dim, flickering light. Saitama sat on a metal stool that groaned under his weight, his chin resting in his palm. He looked less like a cosmic threat and more like a man waiting for a slow clerk to finish a transaction. "Who sent you?" Lyra's voice was a low rasp, stripped of all warmth. "Was it the ruinous powers? Are you a puppet of the weaver of fates sent to mock our faith with this performance of simplicity?" Saitama blinked, his gaze drifting to a small crack in the iron wall. "I told you already," he said, his voice as flat as a desert floor. "I'm a hero for fun." "Well, I was heading to the supermarket for the weekend sale. There was a weird flash of light, and now I'm here. Honestly, this room is really depressing. You should put up a poster or something, maybe a cat." One of the acolytes stepped forward, his hand twitching toward a shock baton, but Lyra raised a gloved hand to stop him. The absurdity of Saitama's answers was a weapon in itself. It defied every interrogation protocol she had mastered over a century of service. "Hero," she repeated, the word sounding like a curse. "In this galaxy there are no heroes. There are only martyrs and those who have not yet died for the golden throne. Duty is the only currency of value. We sacrifice millions to save billions. We bleed so that humanity might see one more sunrise." She leaned forward, her sapphire cybernetic eye whirring as it zoomed in on Saitama's iris. "I have ordered the exterminatus of an entire world. 7 billion souls burned to ash, simply because a single seed of chaos took root in its soil. I watched as the atmosphere turned to fire. That is what it means to serve. That is the price of survival. She slammed a fist onto the iron table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. And you speak of fun and supermarkets, while we drown in an ocean of blood. Your presence is an insult to every soldier who has died in the name of the Emperor. Saitama looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the vacancy in his eyes softened into something resembling pity. He didn't look at the Inquisitor. He looked at the woman behind the armor, the one who carried the ghosts of 7 billion people in her gaze like a leaden shroud. Sounds like a lot of work, he said quietly. Doing all that just because you're afraid. I do what I do because I want to, not because some king on a chair told me to. If you're always sacrificing people just to stay alive, what's the point of being alive in the first place? It just sounds exhausting. Don't you ever just want to take a day off? Lyra's jaw tightened so hard her teeth creaked. For the first time in decades, her absolute ironclad certainty felt a tremor. The man wasn't fighting her with logic or magic or brute strength. He was fighting her with an indifference that made her entire life's work seem like a desperate, meaningless tantrum in a dark room. Her hand hovered over the hilt of her power sword, her mind racing to categorize this entity. If he wasn't a demon and he wasn't a psyker, what was he? A god of apathy, a physical manifestation of the void itself. The tension in the chamber was shattered not by a word but by a violent earth-shaking vibration. A series of deep, rhythmic thuds echoed through the metal floor, followed by the mournful howling wail of a hive-wide klaxon. Red emergency lights began to strobe against the iron walls, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. "My lady," a voice crackled over the Vox intercom, distorted by heavy static. "The cultist cells in the primary ventilation shafts have activated. They've begun the ritual of the red silence. The warp tide is rising inside the station. They're coming through the walls." Lyra stood up in a single fluid motion, her power sword igniting with a lethal blue hiss that cut through the dim light. She didn't look at Saitama as she turned toward the heavy blast doors. "Contain him," she barked at the acolytes, her voice returning to its cold, commanding edge. "If he moves, if he even breathes incorrectly, kill him. I have a city to save." She vanished into the hallway, her red cloak fluttering like a dying wing. Saitama watched her go, then looked at the two masked men who were now pointing electrified pikes directly at his face. The room groaned as the atmospheric pressure shifted, a sign that the reality-warping ritual was taking hold. Screams began to echo from the levels above, not just screams of pain, but screams of something being torn apart at a molecular level. Saitama stood up slowly, stretching his arms until his joints popped. "Well," he muttered, looking at the acolytes, "I guess the grocery store is definitely closed now, and that lady seemed really stressed. Maybe I should go help out so I can find a way home faster." The acolytes lunged their weapons, humming with enough voltage to stop a bullogrin's heart. Saitama didn't even look at them. He simply walked toward the door, and as the pikes struck his chest, the weapon shattered into a shower of sparks and plastic fragments. He didn't feel the electricity. He only felt the urge to get out of this damp, dark basement. The grim darkness of the 41st millennium was about to learn that when a hero for fun decides to get to work, even the gods of chaos should start looking for the exit. The ceiling of the primary hive strata did not merely collapse. It was vaporized by the atmospheric friction of falling stars. Screaming down from the orbit of Orestes, 3 streaks of cerulean fire tore through the toxic smog-trailing plumes of white-hot exhaust. These were not meteors, but the iron angels of the Emperor drop pods of the Adeptus Astartes. They slammed into the plaza outside the interrogation sanctum with the force of tactical nukes, the kinetic impact, sending a shockwave through the ferro-concrete that liquefied the bones of any unshielded mortals nearby. The ground buckled and the air was instantly filled with the roar of retro thrusters and the hissing of holy steam as the armored petals of the pods blew outward. From the central pod stepped Captain Severian. He was a giant of a man, a post-human engine of destruction, encased in Mark VII power armor that had been sanctified by the oil of 1,000 battles. His footsteps were tectonic, each strike of his metal boots cracking the stone beneath him. Around him the air hummed with the scent of sacred unguents, spent promethium, and the sharp, biting chill of the void. He carried a master-crafted bolter as if it were a toy, his eyes scanning the carnage with a cold, tactical precision that had been honed over centuries of total war. He was the personification of the Imperium's wrath, a living weapon designed to know no fear. Severian's gaze locked onto the figure standing amidst the settling dust and rubble. He saw a man in a yellow jumpsuit, a tattered white cape fluttering in the hot wind of the impact. To the captain's enhanced senses, the stranger was a biological impossibility. There was no surge of adrenaline, no spike in heart rate, no psychic residue, nothing that indicated the presence of a living soul in the midst of a war zone. Severian leveled his bolter, the barrel, as wide as a man's wrist, pointed directly at Saitama's head. "Identify yourself, citizen." The captain boomed his voice, amplified by the vox emitters of his helm, into a metallic roar. "You stand in the path of the Emperor's justice. Kneel or be cleared as debris." Saitama looked at the massive warrior, his eyes widening slightly at the sheer scale of the armor. He walked closer, ignoring the red targeting lasers dancing across his face. "Whoa," Saitama said, his voice sounding thin and absurdly casual against the backdrop of falling buildings. "That is some seriously chunky armor, mister. How do you even go to the bathroom in that thing? It looks like a huge pain to take off. Must be a nightmare if you have an itch on your back." The Space Marines around Severian tightened their grips on their chainswords, the teeth of the blades beginning to snarl in anticipation of a kill. "Your insolence is noted, anomaly." Severian growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You are the breach point. The Inquisition has labeled you a null entity. My orders are to secure you for study or to ensure you never leave this world. The stability of the Veil is at stake, and I will not allow a jester to threaten the safety of a Forge world. Quail before the might of the Astartes, for we are the shield of humanity." He took a step forward, the ground groaning under his weight. The sheer physical pressure of his presence enough to make a normal man's heart stop. Saitama just scratched his cheek. "Shield of humanity, huh? Sounds like a lot of responsibility. I just do this as a hobby." Before Severian could respond to the blasphemy, the reality around them groaned and tore. A jagged rift of pulsating, bruised purple light opened in the air between the Marines and Saitama. The temperature plummeted, and the sound of 1,000 discordant voices began to leak from the tear. From the darkness of the warp, the first wave of bloodletters scrambled forth, horrors of brass and muscle-wielding, jagged hellblades that thirsted for souls. The demons of Khorne had arrived, drawn by the psychic vacuum that followed the bald man. The air was filled with the metallic scent of copper and the guttural roar of blood for the blood god. The plaza turned into a charnel house in an instant. The Space Marines reacted with preternatural speed, their bolters barking in rhythmic, thunderous volleys that tore the first wave of demons into heaps of dissolving ichor. Severian swung his power sword, the blue field of the blade shearing through the brass armor of a bloodletter as if it were parchment. But for every demon they struck down, 3 more crawled from the breach. The sky turned a dark, bruised red as the cosmic wound expanded, threatening to swallow the entire sector. "Ignore the jester," Severian shouted over the din of battle. "Form a defensive circle. Protect the pylon site. Death to the enemies of the Emperor." Saitama stood in the center of the swirling chaos, watching as a bloodletter lunged at him with a flaming sword. He didn't move. He didn't even raise his guard. He just watched the red monster with an expression of mild curiosity, wondering if these demons were any more interesting than the monsters back home. The grim darkness of the far future was finally showing its teeth, but for Saitama it just looked like another messy day at the office. The war for Orestes had truly begun, and the Iron Angels were about to see a power that made their gods look like children playing with fire. The first blow was about to land. The sky above the plaza did not simply turn dark. It bruised the atmosphere, curdling into the color of dried blood and rusted iron. A cosmic breach tore through the local reality, sounding like the scream of 1,000,000 tortured violins. The air grew heavy with the smell of ozone and the copper tang of ancient slaughter. Around the feet of the Iron Angels, the very stones began to weep a black, viscous ichor. The vox channels of the Space Marines were suddenly flooded with a cacophony of demonic laughter and the wet, rhythmic thumping of hearts that shouldn't exist. This was no mere tactical threat. It was the arrival of the Imperium, a tide of madness that threatened to drown the world in a sea of visceral horror. Captain Severian slammed his power sword into the chest of a lunging bloodletter, the blue energy field of his blade crackling as it sheared through the creature's brass-hard skin. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice amplified by his vox grill into a thunderous command. "For the Emperor and the Iron Angels, purge the filth." His bolter barked with rhythmic ferocity, each explosive round turning a red-skinned horror into a spray of dissolving mist. Yet for every daemon that fell, 3 more scrambled from the rift, their jagged hellblades glowing with a malevolent, hungry light. The guardsmen nearby were not so fortunate. Their laser guns flickered like dying candles against the darkness, their screams cut short as they were dragged into the swirling shadows. Saitama stood in the eye of this storm, his yellow suit a glaring anomaly amidst the grim, blood-soaked tableau. A bloodletter, its eyes burning with the fires of Khorne's forge, saw the bald man as easy prey. It leaped through the air, its hellblade raised high for a decapitating strike. The creature was a nightmare made flesh, a physical manifestation of rage that defied the laws of biology and physics. To a normal human, it would be an unstoppable force of nature. To the Space Marines, it was a foe requiring every ounce of their transhuman skill. To Saitama, it was just a red guy with a very noisy sword. "Hey, watch where you're swinging that thing," Saitama said, his voice flat and unimpressed. As the demon's blade descended, Saitama didn't reach for a weapon or call upon the light of the throne. He simply raised a hand and delivered a casual, open-palmed slap to the creature's face. The impact was not a sound of flesh hitting flesh. It was the sound of a structural failure. The air in the plaza compressed violently, creating a localized vacuum that pulled the surrounding dust inward. The bloodletter didn't just die, it was erased. Its physical form was vaporized by the sheer kinetic energy, and its warp essence, the very soul stuff that allowed it to manifest, was shattered into non-existence. There was no smoke, no ichor, just a sudden profound absence where a nightmare had been. The battle around him momentarily stuttered. Inquisitor Lyra Voss, watching from the ramparts of the interrogation sanctum, felt her breath hitch. She had seen saints perform miracles. She had seen Grey Knights banish greater demons with holy rites and psychic fire. But what she had just witnessed was something entirely different. It was the complete negation of the warp through raw, mundane physics. There was no holy light, no prayers, no sacrifice. Just a man hitting a demon so hard that the universe forgot the creature ever existed. He did not cleanse it. She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and cold, biting terror. He deleted it. Captain Severian froze his power sword mid-swing. His tactical displays were screaming errors. The sensors in his helm could not calculate the force of the strike, because the numbers were simply too high to be processed by a portable cogitator. The Astartes were the ultimate weapons of the Imperium masters of physical combat. Yet this Null Entity had just bypassed every rule of engagement they lived by. Demons were supposed to be resistant to mundane weapons. They required the weight of faith or the heat of promethium to be truly sent back to the void. Saitama had treated a manifestation of Khorne's wrath like a common housefly. The warp seemed to recoil from the spot where Saitama stood. The red light of the breach flickered as if the reality wound itself was hesitant to touch him. But the silence didn't last. From deep within the pulsating rift, a presence began to emerge that made the lesser demons cower and the space marines tighten their grips on their bolters. The air turned cold and the smell of ozone was replaced by a scent so sweet it made the throat itch, the smell of corrupted perfection. A shadow grew looming over the plaza, a creature of multifaceted wings, and a voice that echoed directly in the mind like 1,000 scratching needles. The demon prince known as Eidolon stepped through the veil, his armor a shifting mosaic of screaming faces and polished obsidian. He ignored the Space Marines and the Inquisitor, his multiple eyes fixing instead on the bald man in the yellow suit. In the shifting tides of the Imperium Saitama was a void, a silent scar that shouldn't be there. He was the one thing the gods could not see, and therefore the one thing they truly desired to destroy. Eidolon raised a clawed hand, and the sound of 1,000 dying stars filled the air. The empty one, the demon prince, hissed the sound, tearing at the sanity of everyone who heard it. You are the silence we seek to fill with our scream. Saitama looked up at the towering horror, his expression still one of mild boredom. He noticed the way the other people, the big guys in armor, and the lady in the red cloak, were looking at him. He didn't like the attention. It felt too much like his old life back in City Z. "You're the boss, I guess," Saitama asked, looking at Eidolon's massive, twisted form. "Look, I'm in a hurry. If I can't find a grocery store, I at least want to find the exit to this place. So if you're going to stand in my way, just do it quickly. I've had a really long day." The demon prince roared a sound that shattered the reinforced glass of the surrounding buildings and sent a psychic shockwave through the plaza that made the Space Marines stumble. But Saitama didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just waited, his red-gloved hands hanging loosely at his sides, a vacuum of indifference in a universe built on rage. The escalation had reached its peak, and the bussa was about to fall. The grim darkness of the far future was about to meet a force that didn't just fight the warp, it ignored it. The silence grew heavy, waiting for the first move. High above the carnage of the plaza, perched upon a gargoyle of rusted iron that had watched over Orestes for 3,000 years, a figure shrouded in shifting iridescent silk remained unseen. Farseer Elenwi of Craft World Ulthway did not look with her eyes but with her soul. To her psychic sight the world was a weaving of silver threads, the skeins of fate. Usually the tides of the warp were a chaotic, screaming ocean, but here around the man in the yellow suit, the ocean had simply stopped. There were no ripples, no currents, no eddies of destiny. Saitama was a bleached patch on the tapestry of existence, a blindingly white space where the gods of chaos could not reach and the ancestors could not speak. Elenwe felt a metaphysical chill that had nothing to do with the freezing temperatures of the hive's upper altitudes. For the Eldari, who viewed time as a flowing river and the warp as the wind upon its surface, Saitama was a drought. He was the end of the river. Every time he moved, the surrounding threads of fate didn't just bend, they snapped and disintegrated into nothingness. "He has no destiny," she whispered into the psychic void, her voice unheard by any mortal ear. The future shatters around him. He is not a player on the board. He is the hand that knocks the pieces over by accident. To the Eldar, who lived and died by prophecy, this was the ultimate horror, a being who rendered foresight obsolete. Below her, Demon Prince Eidolon felt a sensation he had forgotten since his ascension, an emptiness that was not a hunger. Chaos was a storm of infinite emotion, rage, desire, despair, but it was ultimately a storm that required the air of a soul to burn. Saitama was a vacuum. To the dark gods he was a prize beyond measure, a blank so profound that if they could only stain it with a single drop of hatred or pride, they would achieve a victory that would echo through the warp for eternity. Eidolon leaned forward, his multifaceted eyes fixing on the bald man. He saw a void that the great rift itself could not fill, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on his spirit. "You are the vacuum we crave." Eidolon hissed, the sound tearing at the sanity of the nearby guardsmen and causing the Space Marines to tighten their grips on their bolters. "You are the silence that the architect of fate has whispered of in the dark. Come, empty one. Let us fill you with the glory of the warp. Let us give your meaningless existence the weight of a god's obsession." The demon prince raised a clawed hand, and the air between them began to curdle, turning into a thick purple miasma that smelled of rotting lilies and old copper. But the mist didn't touch Saitama. It simply dissolved a few inches from his skin, unable to find a foothold in the aura of absolute normalcy he projected. The sensory experience of the plaza had shifted. The usual sounds of battle, the roar of bolters, the screams of the dying, the rhythmic chanting of the tech priests, were being swallowed by a strange static-like distortion. It wasn't that the noise had stopped. It was that the air was refusing to carry it. The smell of the battlefield, the blood, the oil, the burning promethium, vanished within a few paces of Saitama. It was replaced by a sterile hollow nothingness. It was as if a sphere of absolute zero had been carved out of the universe. The Iron Angels felt their hair stand on end, a primal genetic instinct, screaming at them that they were standing on the edge of a precipice. Captain Severian watched the interaction with a growing sense of dread. He was a soldier of the Emperor, a post-human warrior trained to face the most terrifying entities in the galaxy. He had fought hive tyrants and Necron overlords, things that followed the laws of war, however alien they might be. But this was different. The demon prince was offering the stranger godhood, and the stranger looked as though he were trying to remember if he'd turned the stove off before leaving home. The sheer indifference of the bald man was more chilling than the demon's threats. It was a vacuum of meaning in a universe built on the struggle for it. Deep within the command sanctum of the Forge World, Magos Kepra 9's remaining biological heart hammered against her mechanical chest cavity. Her data slates were flickering with binary warnings that bordered on the blasphemous. Logos error 000. The screens blinked in rhythmic, angry red. She cross-referenced the energy signature of the Null Entity with the final catastrophic readings of the Pylon Mirror before it had shattered. The waveforms didn't just resemble each other. They were identical in frequency and amplitude. The intruder was not a consequence of the breach. The intruder is the breach Keeper 9 transmitted to Inquisitor Lyra Voss via a secure encrypted vox burst. My lady, the energy signature of this individual matches the total failure of the G mirror. He is a localized collapse of the physical laws that maintain the barrier between our world and the Imperium. We did not invite a savior, Lyra. We invited the collapse itself. His very presence is eroding the fabric of Orestes. If he stays, the planet will not be conquered by chaos. It will simply cease to exist, dissolved by his lack of resonance. The Magos's voice, usually a cold synth drone, was now sharp with an almost human panic. Lyra Voss received the data, her cybernetic eye zooming in on the scrolling numbers. Her grip on her power sword tightened until the leather of her glove creaked. If the Mechanicus was right, then every second Saitama remained on Orestes. The barrier between the real and the unreal grew thinner, not because of the demons, but because of his own weight. He was a universal solvent, a hole in the logic of the Imperium. She looked back at the plaza where the bald man was currently picking a piece of lint off his yellow sleeve, while a literal prince of hell offered him the universe. "He is the silence that kills," Lyra muttered to herself, her heart sinking. The alarm for a sector-wide reality collapse began to howl from the high towers, its scream a futile protest against the coming void. The situation had escalated beyond a mere invasion. They were facing the end of the world, brought about by a man who just wanted to find a supermarket. Saitama looked up at Eidolon, finally speaking with a voice that was painfully, terribly ordinary. "I don't want to be a god," he said. "I just want to go home. And you're really loud." The air in the plaza began to tremble, and the Pylon Mirror's remains started to glow with a blinding white light. The Forge World of Orestes was reaching its breaking point. The atmosphere of Orestes did not just crack. It began to unspool. Around the central spire of the Forge World, the air turned a violent shade of bruised violet, but within the immediate vicinity of the pylon site, reality felt thin like parchment held too close to a flame. The smell of scorched ozone was thick enough to gag the few remaining human laborers, and a low subsonic thrumming vibrated through the metal floor, rattling the teeth of the Skitarii. It was a cosmic dissonance, the scream of the warp meeting the absolute chilling silence of the void. As the gravity sensors began to flicker and fail, the massive industrial gears of the hive groaned in protest against the laws of physics they had obeyed for 10,000 years. Magos Kepra 9 stood amidst the flickering holographic displays of her command sanctum, her mechanical mechadendrites twitching in a rhythmic, agitated pattern. She turned her multi-lensed gaze toward Inquisitor Lyra Voss, who had just stormed into the chamber, her power sword still hummed with the residue of demonic ichor. The Magos's voice was a grating synth drone, stripped of its usual binary certainty. The experiment was not merely to repel the Warp Inquisitor. Kepra 9 confessed, her optical sensors dimming. "We sought the absolute null. We sought to craft a weapon of silence that would deafen the gods themselves. We used the forbidden geometries of the Imga monolith, combined with the logic engines of the Dark Age. We wanted to shut out the voices of the warp, and instead we invited something that doesn't even have a voice." Lyra's face was a mask of cold, murderous fury. She stepped toward the Magos, the blue light of her power sword illuminating the ancient oil-stained robes of the tech priest. "You played with the fires of the abyss and wonder why the world is burning, Magos." She hissed, the threat of execution hanging heavy in the air. "To create a vacuum is to invite the pressure of the Imperium to crush us. You have committed a sacrilege against the very soul of the Imperium. This intruder, this man in yellow, is the physical manifestation of your hubris. He is the hole you dug in reality." The Magos did not flinch. Her logic circuits were already processing the inevitability of her own termination, yet she remained fixated on the data streams. Saitama, standing nearby and picking at a loose thread on his red glove, looked up. He had been listening to the jargon and the shouting, but the phrase creating silence struck a chord in the hollow space where his excitement used to live. He knew silence. He lived in it every day, the silence of a world where no opponent could make him feel his own heartbeat, the silence of a life where the volume of existence had been turned down to zero. Silence, huh? He muttered, his voice sounding small but strangely heavy in the pressurized room. I get it. It's quiet when you're too strong. But you guys talk a lot for people who want things to be still. It's kind of annoying. Captain Severian stepped into the light, his massive cerulean power armor reflecting the flickering emergency strobes. He looked at the Inquisitor, then at the Magos, and finally at Saitama. The triangle of conflict was drawn in the dust of the crumbling forge. The Magos is a heretic. Severian boomed, his vox grill vibrating with the weight of his judgment. But the anomaly is a tactical asset of the highest order. If he is the key to this silence, he must be secured, not destroyed. The chapter requires his essence for study. He is the Emperor's shield made manifest regardless of his lack of faith. He stood like a wall of ceramite between Lyra's zealotry and the confused hero. The tension was a coiled spring ready to snap. Lyra wanted a cleansing fire to erase the mistake. Severian wanted to weaponize the vacuum, and Saitama just wanted to find the exit before he missed whatever passed for dinner in this nightmare. The air was thick with the scent of electronic incense and the rhythmic prayer-like chanting of the damaged cogitators. You don't understand, Keeper 9 whispered, a spark of genuine terror flickering in her mechanical eyes. We didn't just invite him, we are becoming him. The silence is spreading. Look at the Vox channels, look at the sky. The weight of his presence is dragging the planet into the sub-levels of reality. As if to punctuate her warning, the floor suddenly lurched. A massive groaning sound tore through the hive as the gravity stabilizers finally surrendered to the spreading anti-warp field. Pieces of debris, rusted metal, and even a few unanchored servitors began to drift slowly upward into the ozone-choked air. Saitama felt his boots leave the ground for a second before he instinctively adjusted his weight. He looked out through a shattered viewing port at the hive city below. The massive towers were no longer standing firm. They were swaying like weeds in an underwater current, their foundations dissolving into a shimmering white void. This is bad, Saitama said, his face returning to its signature blank expression as he watched a multi-ton crane drift past the window. I don't think the stores are going to be open if the buildings are floating away. The cosmic breach was no longer a hole in the sky. It was the ground beneath their feet. The Forge world was losing its grip on the material universe, and the only thing keeping them anchored was the very man who was causing the drift. The silence wasn't coming. It was already here, and it was hungry for everything that made a sound. The majesty of the Forge world was dying a silent, suffocating death. As the anti-warp field generated by Saitama's presence expanded, it didn't just repel the demons, it began to unravel the delicate tapestry of technology that kept millions alive. The life support cogitators, ancient and temperamental, could not function in a zone of absolute null resonance. Across the mid-hive sectors, the rhythmic thrum of the oxygen recyclers sputtered and fell silent. The air, once a thick soup of industrial fumes, became a thin, frigid vacuum. In the residential hab blocks, the lights flickered out, replaced by a terrifying, oppressive darkness. Civilians who had survived the demonic incursion only moments ago now found themselves clutching their throats, their faces turning a sickly shade of blue in the dim emergency lighting. Saitama moved through the corridors of the hab block like a golden blur. To any normal eye, he was invisible, a mere ripple in the stagnant air. He caught a falling mother before she could drift into a grinding ventilator fan. He kicked open jammed blast doors that required hydraulic rams to budge dragging groups of gasping workers into pressurized subvaults. But for every 10 people he tucked into safety, he saw 100 more through the thick, reinforced glass of the outer walkways, people he couldn't reach their bodies, floating limply in the zero-gravity zones like discarded dolls. For the first time since arriving in this grim galaxy, the vacancy in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, biting flicker of frustration. He was the strongest man in the universe, but he was currently fighting an enemy he couldn't punch: the absence of air. In a crumbling transit hub, Saitama found Sergeant Rook. The soldier was slumped against a bulkhead, his helmet discarded, his lungs burning as he fought for every shallow, agonizing breath. Rook looked up, his vision blurring, seeing the man in the yellow suit, standing over him, untouched by the vacuum, unbothered by the cold. Saitama reached down, hoisting the armored man over his shoulder with effortless ease. "Hang in there, soldier," Saitama said, his voice sounding oddly resonant in the thinning atmosphere. "I found a room down the hall that still has some air. Just stop talking and breathe." Rook managed a weak, rattling laugh, the sound of blood and phlegm in his throat. "Why?" he wheezed, clutching at Saitama's cape. "Why bother with me? I am just a single bolt in the machine. I was born to die for the Golden Throne. My life is a currency spent for the Emperor." He looked at the carnage around them, the silent floating corpses and the dying fires. "I have no name, only a duty. Why save a man who has already accepted his end?" Saitama stopped at the heavy iron door of the pressurized vault, his expression unreadable. He looked at the sergeant not as a pawn of a galactic empire, but as a person. "Because I'm free," Saitama replied, his voice flat but carrying a weight that silenced the groaning of the shifting metal. "And because I don't think you actually want to die yet. You're just saying that because you don't know what else to say." He pushed the door open, the hiss of returning pressure whistling in Rook's ears. He set the sergeant down among a group of terrified refugees who were huddling together in the dim light. "I don't care about your emperor or your machine. I just don't like seeing people go out like this. It's boring and it's sad." Rook stared at him, his mind reeling. In a universe where every act was measured in sacrifice and religious fervor, Saitama's simple, selfish kindness was more terrifying than any heresy. The moment of respite was shattered by a sound that wasn't a sound. A wave of crimson psychic energy washed through the hub, turning the white void of the anti-warp field into a shimmering bloody mist. It was the red silence, a weapon of the demon Prince Eidolon. The refugees began to scream, but no sound came out of their mouths. Their voices were being stolen by the warp, even as the air returned to their lungs. The walls of the vault began to bleed, and the floor vibrated with a rhythmic, hateful pulse. The demon was no longer trying to breach the silence. He was trying to corrupt it, turning the peace of the void into a prison of eternal agony. Saitama stood at the entrance of the vault, his back to the survivors. He watched as the red mist coiled like snakes along the ceiling, the faces of screaming demons forming in the vapors. He felt a familiar, dull itch in his knuckles. This world was loud, it was messy, and it was full of people who thought they had to die for a cause they didn't understand. But as the red silence pressed against him, trying to find a crack in his indifference, Saitama finally tightened his fist. He was tired of the speeches, tired of the suffering, and tired of being told what was inevitable. "You guys really don't know when to quit," Saitama muttered, stepping out into the hallway as the door sealed behind him. The air was gone, the gravity was a memory, and a god of chaos was knocking on the door. To the Imperium, it was an apocalypse. To Saitama, it was a nuisance that needed to be cleared before the day was over. The ground beneath his feet cracked as he lowered his center of gravity, the sheer weight of his intent causing the reality warpers to recoil. The red silence met the King of the Void. The air in the heart of the hive was no longer air. It was a pressurized psychic static that tasted of copper and ancient forgotten sorrows. Amidst the shifting shadows and the bleeding walls of the red silence, a shimmer of iridescent light coalesced into the form of Farseer Elenwe. She did not walk. She drifted, her feet barely touching the gore-slicked floor. Her presence was a sharp crystalline contrast to the industrial rot of the Underhive. She moved toward Saitama, her spirit stones glowing with a frantic pulsing energy. The bald man turned blinking at the tall, elegant alien whose face was hidden behind an ornate, ghostly helm. He didn't look impressed, merely confused by the arrival of yet another person in a costume. "You are a fracture in the weave, Mon Ki." The Farseer's voice echoed directly inside Saitama's mind, a silver needle of sound that bypassed the physical world. She gestured toward the swirling vortex of white light, where the Pylon Mirror had once stood, the source of the anomaly that had dragged Saitama into this reality. "You fell through the wound we created, a physical void summoned by the blind greed of the machine cult. You are the silence they prayed for, but you are also the weight that will crush this world into non-existence if you remain. The threads of destiny have knotted around you, and they are beginning to snap." Saitama scratched his head, looking from the Farseer to the white storm raging in the center of the chamber. "Look, I get that I'm not from around here," he said, his voice sounding terribly mundane in the telepathic link. "But everyone keeps telling me I'm a problem. I'm just standing here." The Farseer stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch the empty air between them. "The pylon is the key," she whispered her thoughts, projecting a vision of his home. The gray streets of Z City, the quiet apartment, the grocery store circulars. A single serious strike against the core of the mirror will tear the veil open. It will create a bridge of sheer kinetic force that can carry you back to your own reality. But the backlash, the shockwave of such a blow, will shatter Orestes. The planet will break, and the millions you saved from the demons will die in the cold dark of space. She paused, the weight of the galaxy's cruelty pressing in. "This world is a tomb of 1,000,000,000,000 souls, a machine of endless war. Is it worth staying for? Go home or save this world. Choose, Mon Ki. The bridge is open for a heartbeat, but it requires the death of a world to cross." Saitama looked at the vision of his home, then at the memory of Sergeant Rook's desperate, gasping breath. He thought of the billions of nameless people, huddled in the dark, waiting for a miracle they didn't deserve. He had arrived through a tear in the material veil, a physical echo of the failed Pylon Mirror experiment that now threatened to dissolve the entire sector into a silent vacuum. The psychic communion was shattered by the harsh metallic bark of a vox speaker. "Do not listen to the Xenos witch." Inquisitor Lyra Voss emerged from the smoke, her power armor scarred and blackened by fire. Behind her, a phalanx of stormtroopers and a squad of gray knights in silver-plated armor leveled their weapons. The light of their purity seals flickered against the encroaching warp mist. Lyra's cybernetic eye was burning with a frantic zealot's light. "He is the Emperor's curse or his blessing, but he belongs to the throne. If he attempts to flee or destroy this world, he is to be purged." She raised her power sword, the blade crackling with a white-hot fury. "In the name of the Ordo Hereticus, I decree punishment." The soldiers didn't hesitate. A storm of bolter fire and psychic lightning erupted, directed not at the Farseer, but at the man in yellow. The rounds hammered into Saitama's back, exploding in a cacophony of fire and shrapnel that filled the room with blinding light. The gray knights moved in a synchronized dance of death, their halberds glowing with the power to banish gods. To the Inquisition, Saitama was no longer a person. He was a holy relic or a demonic stain, and both needed to be contained by force. They didn't see a hero. They saw a variable that defied the Emperor's divine order, and in their world defiance was the ultimate sin. The smoke cleared, revealing Saitama standing exactly where he had been. His suit was slightly singed, and there was a small tear in his cape, but otherwise he looked perfectly fine. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. He turned his head slightly, glancing back at the Inquisitor over his shoulder. The air around him grew heavy, the pressure of his presence suddenly spiking until the Grey Knights felt their knees buckle under a weight that wasn't psychic but purely physical. "You people really like to make things complicated," Saitama said, his voice flat but carrying an edge that silenced the room. "You talk about duty and sacrifice, but you're just as noisy as the monsters." He turned away from the Inquisition, walking toward the center of the cosmic storm. The Farseer watched him, her spirit stones dimming in the face of his overwhelming reality. Home later, he muttered to himself, his red gloves tightening into fists. "Right now, I've got to do something about this noise." He stepped into the heart of the white breach, the light swallowing his yellow cape, as the world began to vibrate with a sound that wasn't a scream but a deep, resonant hum. The punishment of the Inquisition was forgotten as the storm reached its peak. For the first time in 10,000 years, the warp felt something it had never known, the approach of a singular, unavoidable truth. The story will continue. What would you choose if you were in Saitama's shoes? A certain return to a peaceful home at the cost of billions, or staying in a nightmare galaxy to fight a war that never ends? Thank you for watching this chapter. If you enjoyed this journey into the grim darkness with the world's strongest hero, please don't forget to like and subscribe for the next part of the series. The air in the sanctum shattered as Inquisitor Lyra Voss slammed her palm onto a runic console. Activation sequence Null Cipher 9. She screamed, her voice cracking with the strain of religious fervor. From the vaulted ceiling, massive brass-encased projectors descended, humming with a sickly, pale light. This was the Inquisition's ultimate countermeasure for high-level warp threats, a containment field designed to paralyze the soul and lock a target in a localized stasis of absolute zero resonance. The silver-plated floors glowed as hexagrammatic wards ignited, casting a grid of blue energy that sought to bind Saitama's every atom. The sound was a high-pitched, agonizing whine that made the ears of every mortal in the room bleed. Saitama stood in the center of the geometric trap, his knees slightly bent, his expression remaining as blank as a sheet of unwritten parchment. He felt a strange tingling on his skin, like the static electricity from a wool sweater on a dry winter day. He looked at the glowing blue lines beneath his boots, and then back at the Inquisitor. "Is this supposed to do something?" he asked, his voice cutting through the screeching of the machines with terrifying clarity. "It tickles a little, but honestly, it's just making it harder to hear myself think." "Can you turn it down?" He took a step forward, and the sound of the containment field didn't just fade, it shattered. The blue energy lines cracked like glass, and the massive projectors overhead exploded in a shower of molten brass and sparking wires. Captain Severian did not wait for the smoke to clear. Iron Angel's engaged target is a Class Alpha threat suppression pattern, Omega. The Space Marines moved with a coordination that was almost supernatural. They didn't just charge, they flowed through the chamber, their bolters barking in rhythmic, overlapping volleys. Explosive rounds hammered into the space where Saitama stood, creating a continuous wall of fire and shrapnel. Severian himself lunged forward, his power sword, a blur of blue lethality, aimed at the stranger's neck. To an observer, it was a display of the finest military discipline in the galaxy, a calculated storm of steel and fire meant to erase any obstacle in the Emperor's path. Saitama wasn't there when the blades landed. He moved, but it wasn't a run. It was a series of rhythmic lateral jumps. Serious side hops, he muttered. To the Astartes, it looked as though the bald man had duplicated himself, dozens of yellow-suited phantoms appearing and disappearing in every corner of the room simultaneously. Each hop displaced the air with the force of a sonic boom. The atmospheric pressure in the room spiked and plummeted so violently that the reinforced glass of the viewing ports turned to dust. The shockwaves alone, mere byproducts of his motion, caught the charging space marines and tossed them aside like toys thrown by a frustrated child. Severian felt the air being ripped from his lungs as he was blown backward, his 1,000-ton armor skidding across the ferroconcrete. The captain regained his footing, his sensors struggling to recalibrate. He watched as his brother's warriors, who had conquered entire star systems, were swept away by nothing more than the wind of the intruder's movement. The sheer physical impossibility of the act struck a blow to Severian's core that no blade could ever deliver. He had spent centuries mastering the art of the blade, the science of the siege, and the theology of war. He was a demigod of the battlefield. Yet in the face of this man, all his training was reduced to a joke without a punchline. The stranger wasn't even fighting. He was just moving. Saitama stopped standing amidst the wreckage of the tactical formation. He looked at the discarded bolter shells littering the floor, and then at the Marines who were slowly trying to stand up. "Hey," Saitama said, pointing at a smoking barrel. "You guys should probably stop shooting. I'm telling you, it's a total waste of ammo. I don't know how much that stuff costs here, but back home wasting resources like that would be a real problem for the budget." His voice was devoid of malice, which only made the insult feel more profound. To the Astartes, he wasn't just a monster. He was a mockery of everything they stood for, a power that required no ritual, no faith, and no sacrifice. The dust and ozone filled the chamber, creating a gray, choking haze. From the shadows near the primary security gates, Sergeant Rook watched the scene with wide, trembling eyes. He held his lasgun in shaking hands, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He had been ordered to fire upon the anomaly on sight, but as he looked at Saitama, he didn't see a demon or a heretic. He saw the man who had carried him through the vacuum, the man who had looked at him as a person rather than a bolt in a machine. He saw the Inquisitor's face twisted in a mask of obsessive hate, and then he looked at the bald man's simple, bored expression. Lyra Voss began to scream a new set of codes, her fingers flying across a backup Vox unit to call in the orbital strikes. "He is the void. He is the end of the light. Purge the sector. Burn the hive to the ground if you must." She was no longer a judge. She was a wildfire. Rook felt a sudden cold clarity. If he followed his orders, the man who saved him would be hunted until the world was ash. But if he didn't, he reached out and slammed his fist into the emergency override for the sub-level transit lifts. The heavy blast doors behind Saitama groaned and began to slide open, revealing a dark vertical shaft that led deep into the heart of the Forge World's forbidden vaults. "This way," Rook hissed over the Vox, his voice a desperate whisper that caught Saitama's attention. "Go down to the sub-levels. They can't track you in the deep catacombs." Saitama looked at the soldier, then at the screaming Inquisitor and the recovering Marines. He gave Rook a small, quick thumbs up that seemed absurdly out of place in the grim Gothic ruins. "Thanks, buddy. I owe you one," Saitama said. With a casual step, he vanished into the darkness of the shaft, the air whistling behind him as he descended at a speed that defied gravity. The blast doors slammed shut, locked by Rook's unauthorized override. The sergeant stood alone for a moment, listening to the sound of his own heart hammering against his ribs. He knew his life was over. He knew the Inquisition would find him, and the price for his betrayal would be a fate worse than death. But as he looked at the sealed door, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. For one moment in the grim darkness of the far millennium, he hadn't been a soldier of the Emperor. He had been a human being helping a friend. The hunt was far from over, but the prey had just gone where even the light of the throne dared not follow. What would you do if you were Rook? Stay loyal to the only empire you've ever known, or risk everything for a stranger who showed you a spark of humanity? The descent into the guts of Orestes was a journey through the evolution of mechanical cruelty. The transit lift, a rusted iron cage, suspended by chains thick as a man's torso, plunged into the crushing darkness of the sub-fab levels. Saitama stood in the center, his yellow suit a glaring, defiant speck of color in the shadows. Beside him, Sergeant Rook gripped his lasgun with white-knuckled intensity, his breath coming in ragged hitches. The third passenger was a low-ranking tech priest, an initiate, whose name had been replaced by the designation Romu. The priest's mechadendrites twitched in a rhythmic, nervous cadence as they moved through the layers of the planet's crust, descending past the reach of the Inquisition's immediate wrath. The temperature rose, but it was not the warmth of a sun. It was the stagnant, suffocating heat of friction, the sound of 10,000 years of grinding gears, and the thermal exhaust of a billion unthinking machines. The air here was a visible fog of oil mist and pulverized stone tasting of iron and the copper tang of ancient dried blood. As the lift rattled lower, the distant hum of the hive spire was replaced by a deep subsonic thrumming that vibrated in the marrow of their bones. They were entering the womb of the Forge, where the resources of the Imperium were processed, and where the line between flesh and steel was blurred into a smear of gray efficiency. The lift doors groaned open with a sound like a dying beast, revealing a vista of industrial nightmare. Miles of conveyor belts stretched into the smog-choked distance, illuminated by the sickly amber glow of flickering magnesium torches. On these belts were things that had once been men and women. They were being processed in a grotesque assembly line parody of surgery. Saitama watched his face pale under the harsh lighting as massive hydraulic clamps held a struggling prisoner in place while a circular saw removed the top of their skull. There was no anesthetic, only the rhythmic, mindless chanting of the data stacks that sought to drown out the wet, high-pitched screams of the newly initiated. "What is this?" Saitama asked, his voice sounding hollow and remarkably small against the roar of the factory. He watched as a robotic arm riveted a heavy steel plate into the exposed chest of a worker, the sound of the pneumatic hammer echoing like a gunshot. Romu's Vox grill buzzed with a static-laden response. "This is the manufactorum of the blessed servitude. Here the dregs of the hive, the criminals, the failures, the heretics, are granted the ultimate mercy. They are relieved of the burden of self. They are stripped of their memories and their desires so that they may serve the Omnissiah without doubt." Saitama walked along the edge of the processing floor, his boots silent on the iron grating. He saw a row of servitors whose legs had been replaced by heavy tread units, their eyes scooped out and replaced by red thermal sensors that flickered with a cold, unthinking light. Some had their jaws removed to make room for feeding tubes. Others had their hands replaced with drills or saws that whirred in a constant low-frequency hum. They moved in perfect, terrifying unison, their remaining biological parts pale and sickly against the black iron of their augmentations. There was no soul in their gaze, only a vacant mechanical obedience. "Is this what you guys do for work?" Saitama muttered, stopping before a half-finished unit. The person it had been, a young man, once stared through him, his mouth hanging open in a silent, eternal gasp. He is now a cogitator interface, Romu explained, the priest's voice devoid of any empathy. He will spend the next 2 centuries calculating the fuel flow of the spire's primary boilers. It is a high honor. He is no longer capable of sin. Saitama felt a cold knot of anger tightening in his chest. He had fought monsters that ate people, and he had fought villains who wanted to rule the world, but he had never seen anything so calculated, so cold, and so utterly devoid of humanity. The smell was a nauseating blend of gangrene promethium and the chemical scent of preserving fluids. Rook turned away, leaning against a rusted pillar and vomiting into the shadows. Even for a soldier of the PDF, hardened by the sight of hive wars and the brutal justice of the Imperium, this was too much. It was a production line of meat and steel, a factory where the human soul was treated as a waste product to be discarded. "This is hell," Rook wheezed, wiping his mouth with a trembling hand. "I always thought the warp was the enemy, but we did this to ourselves. We made this." Saitama didn't answer. He was looking at the endless rows of silent, hollowed-out people. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel bored. He felt a deep, resonant disgust. The grim darkness of the 41st millennium wasn't just about the war in the stars. It was about the slow, grinding death of everything that made a person a person. As he watched a mechanical claw toss a discarded limb into a waste chute, the air around him grew suddenly unnaturally cold. The industrial noise of the factory didn't stop, but it seemed to recede, as if they were being pulled into a private pocket of the universe. Inside Saitama's mind, a voice began to slither. It was a voice like silk over broken glass, dripping with a multifaceted, alien delight. "Look at them, empty one," the voice of Demon Prince Eidolon hissed, echoing directly in the void where Saitama's psychic resonance should have been. "This is the order you protect. This is the peace of the Golden Throne. They turn their children into cogs so they do not have to feel the fear of the dark. Why fight for a machine that eats its own? Come into the scream. Join the warp, and I will give you a feeling you have never known, a rage that will never end, a joy that will never fade." Saitama felt a slight pressure behind his eyes, a greasy psychic touch, trying to find a hook in his thoughts. He stopped walking, his head tilted slightly to the side as he listened to the voice. Romu and Rook froze, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The red emergency lights along the ceiling flared, once casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to dance with a malevolent life of their own. The darkness of the sublevels seemed to breathe, pressing inward, as if the very walls were closing in to watch the hero break. "You talk too much," Saitama said, his voice flat and unimpressed by the demon's grandiosity. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't call upon any inner strength. He just existed. The psychic touch of Eidolon didn't find a hook. It found a vacuum. The demon's influence slipped off Saitama's consciousness like water off a stone. "And this place is loud enough without you whispering in my head. If you've got something to say, come down here and say it to my face." The pressure in the room snapped, and the air returned to its heavy industrial heat. Eidolon's laughter echoed one last time, a sound of pure, mocking malice that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. The descent was over. They had reached the bottom of the hive, the threshold of the deep catacombs where the pylon's roots met the bedrock of the world. Ahead of them, a massive blast-shielded vault door stood partially open, leaking a sickly violet light that pulsed like a dying heart. The true battle for the soul of Orestes was about to begin in the place where silence and the scream were one. The heavy vault door groaned its ancient hinges, screaming as they yielded to the violet pressure from within. As Saitama stepped across the threshold, the industrial reality of the Forge world did not just fade, it dissolved into a shimmering, oily haze. The iron floor turned into a surface of reflective obsidian, and the air grew thick with a scent that was both intoxicating and repulsive, like rotting lilies dipped in honey. Behind him, Sergeant Rook let out a choked cry, falling to his knees as the psychic weight of the chamber crushed his mortal senses. But for Saitama, the transition was as unremarkable as walking from one room to another. He simply stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at a horizon that shouldn't exist. "Another one of these things," Saitama muttered, his voice echoing in a way that defied the laws of acoustics. The space around him began to warp, coalescing into a vision of a burning wasteland under a sky of swirling, bruised purple clouds. In the distance, a figure stood, a warrior clad in armor of shifting starlight, wielding a blade that hummed with the vibration of 1,000,000,000 dying suns. The air between them crackled with a power so immense that the very ground turned to glass. It was the image of the perfect foe, the worthy opponent Saitama had spent his entire life searching for. The being let out a roar that shook the firmament, and for a fleeting, dangerous second, Saitama felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, a pulse in his chest. The voice of Eidolon hissed from the burning air, wrapping around Saitama's mind like a silk noose. "I can give you what you crave, Empty One. I have scoured the histories of 1,000 galaxies to find this for you. A struggle that will not end in a single blow. A pain that will remind you that you are alive. A rage that will burn away the hollow boredom of your existence. Just reach out, embrace the chaos, and let us show you what it means to feel again." The Demon Prince's promise was a masterpiece of psychic architecture, built specifically to exploit the one crack in Saitama's invulnerability, his existential ennui. The warrior in the distance lunged the shockwave of his first step, shattering the obsidian floor. Saitama watched the approaching blade, his face remaining frustratingly blank. He waited for the rush, for the adrenaline, for the fear that would make the world feel real again. But as the starlight blade swung toward his neck, he saw the flaw. It was too perfect. It was a scripted dance, a dream woven from the desires of a man who was too tired to dream for himself. The worthy opponent had no weight, no soul, and most importantly, no reason to exist other than to please him. It was just another toy in a universe full of noise. "It's fake," Saitama said, his voice cutting through the demon's roar like a cold wind. "You're just making stuff up because you think I'm lonely. But honestly, this is just as boring as everything else." The vision of the burning wasteland flickered and cracked the sky, peeling away like burnt paper to reveal the cold iron reality of the catacombs beneath. Eidolon's voice turned from silk to a jagged, rusted blade, screeching with a multifaceted fury. "You are empty. You are a vessel of nothingness. How can a being with such power be so utterly devoid of ambition? We offer you the universe and you ask for a price tag." The Demon Prince's presence manifested as a oily black miasma that coiled around Saitama's boots, trying to find a way into his skin, into his blood, into his heart. But there was no entrance. Saitama's indifference was a fortress that even the gods could not siege. "Being empty isn't so bad," Saitama remarked, looking down at the swirling shadows. "If I were full of all the stuff you're talking about, I wouldn't have room for the things that actually matter, like groceries. You can't fit a whole bag of discounted leeks into a heart full of rage. It just doesn't work out." He took a step forward, and the black miasma shattered, dispersed by the simple physical reality of his movement. The illusion was gone, leaving only the dark vault and the agonizing pulse of the corrupted pylon core. A wet, ragged cough pulled Saitama's attention to the side. Sergeant Rook was still on the floor, his hands clawing at his chest, his face contorted in a silent scream. The red silence was tearing at his sanity, showing him visions of his own death, of the Emperor's failure, of a galaxy consumed by fire. Rook was fragile, he was terrified, and he was completely out of his depth. Yet even as his mind began to fray, he reached for his lasgun, his trembling fingers seeking the familiar cold steel of his duty. He wasn't a god, he wasn't a monster, he was just a man who didn't want to give up. Seeing Rook's struggle acted as a strange anchor for Saitama. The hero reached down and grabbed the sergeant by the back of his armor, hoisting him up with a single effortless motion. "Hey, snap out of it," Saitama said, shaking the soldier slightly. "The scary stuff is gone. It was just a bad dream." The simple, grounded weight of Saitama's hand on his shoulder broke the psychic trance. Rook gasped for air, his eyes clearing, as he looked up at the bald man. The horror of the warp was absolute, but the reality of Saitama was even more so. In that moment, Rook realized that the man in yellow wasn't the void, he was the wall that the void broke itself against. The chamber ahead opened into a vast, cathedral-like space dominated by the pylon's core, a towering pillar of black stone that was now encased in a pulsating cage of violet warp energy. 3 figures stood at the edges of the central platform, their wills converging on the artifact. Inquisitor Lyra Voss stood to the left, her power sword glowing with a desperate holy light. To the right, Captain Severian and his remaining marines formed a wall of cerulean steel, and in the center, emerging from the shadows of the pylon itself, was the physical manifestation of Eidolon, a nightmare of multifaceted wings and obsidian armor. The air was so thick with tension that it felt like lead. The laws of the material world were failing. The Forge world was drifting into the abyss, and 3 conflicting ideologies were about to collide at the center of the storm. Saitama stepped onto the platform, Rook leaning heavily on him. He looked at the screaming demon, the zealot Inquisitor, and the iron-willed soldier, and sighed. "All right, let's get this over with," Saitama said, his red-gloved fist tightening. "I'm really starting to get a headache from all this purple light." The end of Orestes was seconds away. Would you choose the comfort of a beautiful lie or the harsh reality of a cold world? Saitama has made his choice. Thank you for watching. If you want to see the final confrontation between the One-Punch Hero and the Prince of Chaos, be sure to like and subscribe. The chamber was a cathedral of gears and agony. At its center, the pylon core stood like a jagged finger of obsidian, pulsing with a light that didn't illuminate so much as it erased. Inquisitor Lyra Voss stood on the left, her power armor scarred and smoking her power sword trembling, in a hand that had known only the weight of judgment. "He is the catalyst," she screamed over the roar of the atmospheric collapse. "The anomaly must be sealed within the core. His void is the only thing that can quench this fire, even if we must burn the planet to do it." Across from her, Captain Severian and his iron angels stood like statues of cerulean steel, their bolters aimed at the rift. "He is an asset of the chapter." Severian countered, his voice a metallic rumble. "We will not allow the Inquisition to throw away a weapon that can redefine the Imperium's strength." Saitama stood between them, looking from the screaming Inquisitor to the hulking Space Marine with a look of profound exhaustion. He was tired of the noise, tired of the politics, and most of all, tired of being treated like a piece of equipment. "You guys are still arguing?" he asked, his voice sounding impossibly small, yet cutting through the psychic storm. "The floor is literally turning into purple soup, and you're fighting over who gets to keep me. I told you I'm just a guy who's lost. I don't want to be anyone's weapon." The air around him shimmered as the anti-warp field intensified, a dome of absolute normalcy that made the violet lightning of the pylon hiss and dissipate as if hitting a brick wall. From a half-shattered cogitator terminal, the voice of Magos Kepra 9 crackled one last time. "Warning! Reality drift at 98%. The Pylon Mirror is no longer reflecting the warp. It is becoming a doorway. We did not create a shield. We created an invitation. As she spoke, the obsidian pillar began to crack. A sound like 1,000 glass bells shattering at once filled the room. The violet energy didn't just glow, it solidified, turning into a thick, viscous liquid that began to swallow the floor. "It is collapsing," the Magos's synthesized voice whispered, followed by the final static-filled prayer of a machine that knew its time was over. The cracks in the pylon bled a crimson darkness that defied the light. From the center of the rupturing stone, a clawed hand the size of an interceptor tank reached out, gripping the reality of the room as if it were a physical curtain. Demon Prince Eidolon did not just step through. He manifested as an eruption of impossible geometry. He was a mountain of obsidian armor and multifaceted wings that seemed to touch every corner of the vast chamber. His voice was a silent scream that tore through the minds of the mortals, a psychic pressure that made Lyra fall to her knees, and Severian's armor groan under the weight. "The silence and the blood are one," Eidolon hissed, his eyes fixing on Saitama. "I will swallow this world, and you shall be the heart of my new empire." With a sudden violent lurch, the walls of the cathedral dissolved. The iron floors, the gears, and the very air were pulled inward toward the demon prince. In an instant, the Forge World of Orestes was gone, replaced by a non-space, a warp pocket, where the sky was a churning sea of red, and the ground was a shifting mosaic of human teeth and silver wire. The atmosphere was leaden, every breath felt like inhaling mercury. Lyra Severian and the remaining Astartes were scattered across the impossible landscape, their weapons flickering as the laws of physics were replaced by the whims of chaos. Saitama alone stood firm, his yellow suit, a glaring defiant stain against the madness of the red silence. "All right," he said, adjusting his glove. "Let's finish this. I've had enough of this place." The threshold has been crossed. Faith and iron have failed, and only the void remains. Between the madness of chaos and the cruelty of the Imperium, where would you stand if you were Saitama? Would you let this galaxy burn, or would you strike back against the gods themselves? Thank you for witnessing this clash of wills. If you want to see the serious punch that will shake the very foundations of the warp, don't forget to like and subscribe to see the final chapters of this epic journey. The arena was not a place, but a fever dream of the Imperium made manifest. Within the heart of the warp pocket, the sky was a churning sea of clotted red, and the ground beneath their feet was composed of the calcified prayers of 1,000,000,000 dead souls. Gravity had become a fickle suggestion. One moment the weight of a mountain pressed down upon their shoulders, and the next they drifted like ash in a gale. Inquisitor Lyra Voss looked down at her hands, only to see her own blood flowing upward in azure droplets defying the laws of biology. Her power sword, once a beacon of holy light, flickered with a sickly black flame that cast no shadows. Beside her, Captain Severian and his iron angels fought a war against shadows, their bolter shells exploding into bursts of silent white petals instead of fire. Demon Prince Eidolon loomed over them, his obsidian form expanding until he seemed to become the horizon itself. He was no longer a physical entity. He was a conceptual horror, a living void that consumed every vibration of sound and light. "In this realm, your strength is a ghost." The demon's voice vibrated through their marrow, bypassing their ears entirely. "Here thought is matter, and your despair is my blade. You are nothing but echoes in a chamber of red silence." He struck out not with a claw, but with a wave of sheer ontological weight. The Astartes were thrown back, their ceramite armor cracking not from impact, but from the sudden, terrifying realization that they were no longer real. Saitama stood in the center of the madness, his yellow suit a glaring illogical stain on the canvas of chaos. He watched as a massive obsidian claw swept toward him, a blow that should have unmade his very existence. He didn't dodge. He simply threw a casual horizontal punch. The impact should have shattered a continent, but as his fist met the demon's chest, it passed through like a hand through smoke. There was no resistance, no bone to break, no armor to crush. Eidolon laughed a sound like 1,000 mirrors cracking. I am the void, empty one. I am the hole in the universe that you carry within yourself. You cannot strike what is not there. Saitama pulled his hand back, looking at his red glove with a look of mild irritation. The air around him began to warp, but not with the energy of the warp. It was a physical distortion, a localized compression of reality caused by his sheer presence. He noticed the way the colors of the world were inverted. The black fires, the blue blood, the white shadows. He realized that this wasn't a fight against a monster. It was a fight against the room itself. To kill the demon, he had to break the stage it stood upon. He lowered his center of gravity, the shifting tooth mosaic floor beneath him, groaning as the pressure of his intent began to override the laws of the warp pocket. I get it now, Saitama said, his voice a solid, immovable pillar of sound in the shifting chaos. You're not a guy. You're just a really big, annoying room, and I've always hated staying in rooms that are too loud. He took a deep breath, and for the first time since entering the 41st millennium, the vacancy in his eyes vanished, replaced by a sharp, terrifying focus. He didn't call upon the Emperor, nor did he fear the dark gods. He simply prepared to exert his will upon the fabric of non-existence. Sirius Ceres, he whispered, his red-gloved fist beginning to glow with a faint white light that was more real than anything the warp could dream of. Sirius, punch. If you were trapped in a realm where your very thoughts could kill you, what would be the first thing you'd try to imagine to survive? The air within the warp pocket did not just freeze. It surrendered. As Saitama drew back his right arm, the shifting mosaic of teeth and silver wire beneath his red boots turned to dust, unable to withstand the mere anticipation of his movement. There was no golden aura, no divine chant, and no psychic flare. Instead, there was a concentration of physical reality so dense that it began to pull the surrounding madness into its own orbit. The red silence of the demon prince Eidolon flickered and groaned the conceptual weight of the Imperium, failing to find purchase against a man who had decided to be serious. Inquisitor Lyra Voss watched through a haze of blood, her spirit stones dimming as she witnessed the impossible. The warp was flinching. Captain Severian, his armor shattered and his bolter empty, saw the world through a fractured lens. He had been taught that only faith and the Emperor's light could push back the dark, yet here stood a man who used nothing but his own muscle. The weight of Saitama's intent was a physical pressure that flattened the nearby shadows and forced the screaming voices of the warp into a terrified, whimpering hush. The demon prince Eidolon, sensing his own erasure, gathered every ounce of his obsidian power for a final strike, his multifaceted wings blotting out the sky of clotted red. But Saitama wasn't looking at the monster. He was looking through it at the very fabric of the nightmare that dared to stand in his way. Sirius Ceres, Saitama whispered, the sound of his voice cutting through the cacophony like a guillotine. Sirius, punch. The strike was not a blow in the traditional sense. It was a cosmic correction. When Saitama's fist made contact with the air, the sound did not travel. It obliterated the medium of sound itself. A blinding, absolute white light erupted from the point of impact, washing away the bruised purples and bloody reds of the warp pocket. The shockwave was not composed of psychic energy, but of raw, unadulterated kinetic force that ignored the lack of atmosphere. It tore through the obsidian form of Eidolon as if he were a cloud of smoke in a hurricane. The demon prince didn't just die, He was unmade, his conceptual essence scattered into the void until not even a memory of his malice remained. The Pylon Mirror at the heart of the chamber, the anchor for this entire cataclysm, shattered into a billion microscopic fragments. The white light expanded outward, a wall of physical law that began to rewrite the laws of the Imperium. The warp pocket didn't just collapse. It was inverted, pushed back by a pressure so immense that the great rift itself felt the vibration. For a single terrifying heartbeat, the logic of the material universe was the only thing that existed. Within the heart of the warp, and the silence that followed was so profound it felt like the birth of a new galaxy. Beyond the localized breach, deep within the churning tides of the Imperium, the great powers felt the tremor. In the brass citadel, Khorne, the god of blood and rage, paused mid-roar, his hand tightening on the hilt of his colossal blade as he felt a physical impact that reached even his throne. In the crystal labyrinth Tzeentch, the weaver of fates watched as 10,000 silver threads of prophecy snapped simultaneously, his intricate plans tangling into a knot he could not unpick. A vibration of pure, indifferent strength had rippled through the warp, a fist of reality that had momentarily pushed back the encroaching tides of chaos. This was not a miracle of the Emperor, but a strike of pure, brutal force, a variable that the gods could not account for. On the Forge World of Orestes, the sky did not return to normal immediately. Instead, a massive circular hole was punched through the toxic smog and the violet warp storm, revealing the cold, distant stars for the first time in centuries. The warp tide receded as if it had been struck by a divine hammer, leaving a dead zone in the psychic fabric of the sector where no demon dared to manifest. The massive industrial engines of the world, which had been groaning under the pressure of the breach, suddenly hummed with a renewed, steady rhythm. The warp was not just defeated, it was cowed, forced back by a power that required no prayer to function. The white light faded, leaving only the dark, cold ruins of the pylon vault. Saitama stood in the center of the wreckage, his right arm still extended, his yellow suit miraculously untouched by the fire. Around him lay the survivors, Inquisitor Lyra, Captain Severian, and the trembling Sergeant Rook, all of them staring at him with eyes that had seen the end of the world and the hand that stopped it. The silence was absolute now, no longer a weapon of the demons, but the natural quiet of a place where the storm has passed. Saitama slowly lowered his fist, his expression returning to its signature blank vacancy. He looked at the shattered remains of the Pylon Mirror, then at his companions, and finally at the open sky through the hole in the ceiling. He felt the weight of the galaxy's gaze upon him, the awe of the mortals, and the curiosity of the gods. But all he felt in return was a dull, familiar ache in his stomach. The serious punch had ended the threat, but it hadn't brought him any closer to a sail or a warm meal. The dust of Orestes began to settle, but the world was no longer the same. The sky, once a swirling vortex of violet madness, was now a pale, empty gray. A light, acidic rain began to fall, pattering against the jagged remains of the pylon vault and the cooling metal of the great forge. The silence that Saitama had brought was not the eerie, pressurized absence of the warp, but the cold, natural quiet of a graveyard after the storm has passed. Across the sector, the warpseers and astropaths of the Imperium noted a phenomenon that would be discussed in hushed, terrified tones for centuries. A dead zone had been carved into the Imperium. In this vast region of space, the voices of the dark gods were nothing but a faint, distant static. The Forge world had been saved, but it had been scarred, a permanent silent wound in the fabric of the warp where a single serious fist had once struck. Inquisitor Lyra Voss stood amidst the wreckage, her power armor hissing as it vented steam and heat. Her biological eye was clouded with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but her cybernetic lens remained fixed on the spot where Saitama stood. She felt a cold, biting realization that transcended her duty. To her, Saitama was more dangerous than any demon or heretic. He was a being of absolute power who required no faith, no ritual, and no sacrifice to overcome the darkness. He was a living refutation of the imperial creed. If the citizens of the Imperium knew that such a power existed, a power that did not demand their souls in exchange for protection, the very foundations of the Golden Throne would crumble into ash. She turned to her surviving acolytes, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that brooked no argument. Seal it. Every log, every pict feed, every memory of this individual is to be purged from the records. Orestes was saved by the grace of the Emperor and the valor of the Astartes. The Null Entity never existed. The decree of damnatio memoriae was signed in the blood-stained dust. Captain Severian stood by the edge of the massive crater created by the Sirius punch. He looked at his broken power sword, then at the empty sky where the stars were finally visible. For the first time in his 3 centuries of service, the Space Marine felt a flicker of something that resembled doubt. He had been forged to be the ultimate weapon of humanity, yet he had been a mere spectator to a force that defied all tactical logic and spiritual law. He watched Saitama, who was currently trying to wipe a smudge of black oil off his yellow sleeve with a look of mild annoyance. The Astartes had been taught that the Imperium was the only shield against the dark, but now he knew there were things in the multiverse that didn't even acknowledge the existence of the dark. He was not a savior, Severian whispered to himself, his voice lost in the wind. He was a storm passing through a candle-lit room. The Iron Angel turned away his footsteps, heavy with the weight of a secret that would haunt his prayers forever. Sergeant Rook sat on a rusted crate near the sub-level entrance, his lasgun resting across his knees. He was alive, a miracle in a world that usually demanded the lives of millions for the sake of a single objective. In his hand he clutched a small, tattered scrap of yellow fabric, a piece of Saitama's cape that had been torn during the final struggle. To the Inquisition, it was a piece of classified refuse to be incinerated. To Rook, it was a holy relic of a different kind. It was a reminder that even in a galaxy of eternal war and grinding cruelty, there was once a man who helped simply because he was there. He tucked the fabric into his pocket, hiding it beneath his flak armor. The history books would never mention the bald man, and the prayers would never name him, but Rook would remember the silence. The world was cold, and the rain was bitter, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a cog in a machine. He felt like a witness. The white rift in the center of the vault began to pulse with a final dying light. It was the last echo of the Pylon Bridge, a bridge of pure kinetic residue that was finally beginning to collapse under its own weight. Saitama felt a tugging sensation, a vacuum pull that recognized his unique, unplaceable frequency. He looked at the survivors one last time, the armored giant, the grim lady in red, and the soldier who had shown him the way. He didn't offer a speech, a heroic farewell, or even a smile. He just gave a small, tired nod, the gesture of a man who had finished a long shift at a job he didn't particularly like. "Well, I guess that's my ride," Saitama muttered as the white light expanded to swallow him whole. In a flash of absolute silence, he was gone. The Forge World of Orestes remained a silent sentinel in a dark galaxy forever marked by the footprint of a hero who was just passing through. The transition was not a dramatic journey through a tunnel of light. It was a sudden, jarring correction of reality. One moment Saitama was standing in the cold, industrial ruins of a forge world surrounded by armored giants and the scent of holy incense. The next he fell with a heavy, unceremonious thud onto the damp asphalt of a narrow alleyway. The air no longer tasted of ozone and ancient machinery. Instead, it smelled of wet pavement, distant car exhaust, and the comforting, mundane aroma of a nearby ramen shop. The oppressive weight of the grimdark galaxy vanished, replaced by the familiar, annoying hum of a modern city. Saitama sat up, slowly rubbing the back of his bald head. He looked around at the brick walls, the overflowing trash bins, and the flickering street lamp that buzzed with a rhythmic, harmless static. There were no demons here, no inquisitors, no eternal wars. He reached out and grabbed a plastic grocery bag that had fallen beside him. He peered inside his face, falling into a mask of genuine tragedy. The premium beef he had fought so hard to find was now a mangled mess of plastic and squashed meat, ruined by the interdimensional trip. He checked his watch and let out a long, defeated sigh. The Saturday sale at the supermarket had ended 10 minutes ago. Meanwhile, in the galaxy far, far away, the Forge World of Orestes began its long recovery. The Inquisition had successfully scrubbed the records, and the Iron Angels had departed for their next war. But deep within the warp, in the sub-reality where the Pylon Mirror had once stood, something remained that even the dark gods could not erase. There was a scar in the Imperium, a literal hollow void in the perfect shape of a clenched fist. It did not bleed, it did not scream, and it did not hunger. It simply was. This fist-shaped silence became a legend among the denizens of the warp. Lesser demons refused to manifest within 100 light-years of the sector, and even the greater demons of chaos felt a phantom ache in their non-existent chests whenever they turned their gaze toward Orestes. It was a monument to an entity that had looked into the face of ultimate madness and responded with nothing but boredom. The grimdark universe continued its march toward oblivion, but for one brief moment it had been told to be quiet. Saitama stood up, brushing the dust of another universe off his yellow jumpsuit. He walked out of the alleyway and onto the busy streets of Z City, disappearing into the crowd of ordinary people living ordinary lives. He didn't feel like a savior of a billion souls. He just felt like a guy who was going to have to settle for convenience store bread for dinner. He looked up at the moon, which seemed so small and quiet compared to the horrors he had just seen, and muttered to himself, "It's the same in any universe. I missed the discount day again." Which universe would you rather live in? One where your every action is part of a grand, tragic destiny, or one where you're free to be as ordinary and bored as you like? Thank you so much for following this special long-form series, The Silent Scar. It has been an incredible journey bringing the world of One Punch Man into the dark future of Warhammer 40,000. If you enjoyed this epic crossover and want to see more hypothetical scenarios or lore deep dives, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Your support keeps the Forge fires burning.